Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Foundation for Science and Technology. My name is David Willits, Chair of the Foundation. Welcome to people who are here with us physically at the Royal Society, and also welcome to our online participants who can, of course, join in the Q&A. Go to Slido and put down your questions online, hashtag 3398303. And I'm delighted that today we are taking a look at space policy and the space agency with just a little bit of history, some assessment of where we are now, and of course, looking to the future. And I'm delighted that we have four excellent speakers. And if I may say so, for me to have Paul Drayson, who preceded me as Minister for Science, has a particular significance. Because when I became Minister for Universities and Science in 2010, the spring of 2010, I can still remember the inheritance, or at least the options that were presented to me by my officials. The new UK Space Agency had just legally been created, but I was told, you know, you're a new government, it's a change of party. Do you wish to stick with this plan, which is only just starting for a space agency? And I was also told that there was this new body, a Space Leadership Council, that was going to bring together people involved in space with different perspectives, academic researchers, the business community, policymakers in a new body. And thirdly, I was presented with a document, a UK Space and Innovation Growth Strategy, 2010 to 2030, which had just come out. And I was also told, you know, new government, you've got this document, but do you think it's of any value? Do you want to stick with it? And what I looked at, I had those three proposals put to me, and it was absolutely clear to me that Paul Drayson had left a fantastic inheritance. And if I tore all that up and started again, we would lose a year or more, and it would be very hard to create anything as significant as he had. I would point out, I think Paul may have suspected that he was going to lose the election. I wasn't sure there was a budget line for a lot of the stuff that Paul had committed us to. That was left as my problem to sort out. But Paul did leave a fantastic inheritance, and part of it, one of those three items, was indeed, as I said, the creation of the UK Space Agency. So I loyally spent over 4 years in that ministerial post implementing the plan for the creation and strengthening and delivery of the arm's-length UK Space Agency as a space agency body. And now fast forward a few years, and the previous government appointed me to chair the UK Space Agency, and I was very touched that the new Labour government coming into power then reappointed me to chair the Space Agency. But after that, having reviewed how many arm's-length bodies there were, they then decided that the Space Agency as an arm's-length body should be abolished. So having begun my ministerial career loyally implementing the previous Labour government's plans to create it, I then ended my time as chair of the Space Agency loyally implementing the new Labour government's plans to abolish it. And that, of course, is politics. And I was I did my best, and there were, and we'll perhaps come to this during the session, by the end, I think there probably were issues around the amount of bureaucratic engagement and flow between the DCIT and the Space Agency, and of course it carries on existing as an entity, though no longer as an arm's-length body with its own board. And what we have today, with four excellent speakers, is an opportunity to review that history, review the experience of those 16 years, and look forward to the future. We'll hear first from Paul, Lord Drayson. We'll then hear from Alice Bunn, who has been closely involved in this, both at Space Agency and now chairing UK Space, representing British business interests in space, who of course had a crucial role in the Space Leadership Council. And we'll then hear from Paul Bate, the final outgoing chief executive of the old Space Agency, and Dave Parker, who was the chief executive of the Space Agency during some of my time as minister. So we're allowed a tiny bit of nostalgia about what the Space Agency achieved, and we're also going to look forward, and where better to start than with the minister who created it. Paul, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, David, for those kind words and for brilliantly implementing what I think still is a terrific strategy. But let me take us back 19 years. 19 years ago, this Royal Society, in its 2007 evidence, stated, as Lord Rees himself described it, we needed a one-stop shop to replace BNSC. And it was that idea which was the foundation for the case for creating a UK Space Agency. And although I was the minister who asked the question, well, why don't we have a UK Space Agency, which seemed an obvious question really for me as a new minister to ask, that was what really kicked it off. So it's kind of you to invite me back again to the Royal Society this evening, to what I can best describe as a wake for the UK Space Agency, following the decision to close the agency and absorb it into DSIT. So let me be blunt. The decision to close the Space Agency is wrong, plain wrong. In the short time I have this evening, I want to cover 3 points and hopefully generate a debate. Why we built it when we did, why closing it is, I believe, a strategic error, and what the UK space community should do about it. Now, the case in 2009 was clear. UK space had productivity 4 times the national average. And despite the fact that we were in an awful recession at the time, it was growing at 9% a year. And that was on public investment of less than 2% of GDP. The sector was completely outperforming its inputs. And the advice we had from the consultation we did with the community, with industry, was that 3 elements mattered. 1, to have executive agency status as an arm's length body, to be able to negotiate with the European Space Agency as a peer, to have a protected budget line so that industrial policy could survive political cycles, as we demonstrated in 2010, and to have a quantified target. And we'd worked hard, and it was good to see that old document shown earlier by David, in our consultation with industry at the time, to come up with an ambition to capture 10% of the global market by 2030. Because without those sort of quantifiable targets, agencies drift. And it worked. If we look at what was achieved subsequent to the creation of the agency, the sector doubled. Harwell became a real cluster. ESA built EXAT on UK soil. But turning to the official reasoning for closing the UK Space Agency, I think as David has already alluded to, things were not perfect. There were real issues. The 2024 NAO report was right that the UK Space Agency had drifted on implementation, that we weren't seeing the return from our investment in ESA that we should be. And this is a governmental problem, civil service generalists had crowded out domain experts. However, none of those problems are solved by closing the agency and absorbing it into DSIT. They would be solved by reinforcing the agency. We're taking an agency that had become too ESA dependent and we're putting it into a department whose budget will be raided every spending review by things like AI compute or other priorities which are being politically championed at that moment in time. We're taking an agency that was criticized for losing technical expertise and merging it into the generalist culture in Whitehall. How does that problem improve when you fold the experts into a department of generalists? And we're doing this at the moment of maximum strategic vulnerability. The space economies are projected to grow to $1.8 trillion by 2035, according to McKinsey. China launches more rockets in a quarter than Europe does in a year. NATO has designated space as an operational domain. This is not the moment to demote the agency. Last year, in November, the House of Lords Space Committee said something quite extraordinary for a Lords Committee. They said, and I quote, "We did not hear evidence arguing for the integration of the agency with the DCIT Space Directorate from any witness. Not a single witness mentioned or called for the policy that the government has now adopted. No one." And the parallels with 2007 are brutal. The UK Space Agency was created to fix the British National Space Centre, a directorate inside a Whitehall department with no protected budget, no independent legal identity, and weak at ESA. That description now fits the new arrangement, and insiders are already calling it BNSC 2.0. We have spent 16 years learning that an arm's-length agency works better for the space sector, and we are forgetting the lesson because we are in a quango cull at the moment. So I have two questions. Is the UK serious about sovereign capability? The 500 million announced last month is roughly a third of the 1.7 billion committed to ESA over the same period. Now, in an age when we cannot rely on US space assets, they're increasingly conditional on the geopolitics, which are fragile. Sovereignty matters more, not less. Does technical expertise survive a civil service merger? In my experience as a minister, the answer is no, it doesn't. A few years from now, most of the senior people who know how to negotiate at ESA, who know how to manage a 100 million mission, to evaluate a propulsion program, most of them will have left. We may be keeping the brand, but we will lose the substance. Now, I'm not asking you to oppose the decision. The political moment for that has passed. But if I can take you back to 2007, then the Royal Society, the Royal Astronomical Society, and industry produced a clear, unified evidence base that made creating the UK Space Agency politically inevitable. That coalition has to come together again. And in my view, do the following. 1, commission a structured assessment of the performance of the merged unit by the end of this year. Check the measurable signals. Hold people to account. Senior technical staff retention. ESA geo-return results. Procurement velocity. Secondly, push for the Lords Committee recommended joint DCIT MOD Minister for Space with a National Security Council seat integrating civil and defence space. 3, make the case publicly that space is critical national infrastructure, not a discretionary budget line. 18% of current UK GDP, around 454 billion, depends on satellite services. So the next time a Treasury official looks at the space budget as cuttable, and believe me, they do, this community needs to have already made that politically impossible. 4, if by 2028 the merged unit is not working, the precedent has been set. An arm's-length space body can be opened at ministerial direction. What I did can be done again. So lobby for it. The key is to build the evidence base now. Closing the UK Space Agency is the wrong decision for the wrong reasons at the wrong time. But I'm not here to mourn it. I'm here because the same coalition that came together back in 2007 to build the agency must make its voice heard again. This community has done it once. It needs to do it again. Thank you.
That's a very powerful start to our conference. Thank you very much, Paul. We're now going to hear from Alice Bunn, who is the chair of UK Space and, of course, has also served as one of the senior advisors to the World Economic Forum on space issues. So, Alice, over to you.
So, good evening, everyone. It's absolutely delightful to be here. I'm not going to lie. When I looked at our esteemed panel ahead of this evening, I thought, we might have a problem here. There's a danger we're all going to vigorously agree and make for a really boring panel. I'm not so worried about that anymore. I think we're going to be fine. So, I wanted to use my 10 minutes to talk about a case for a national space enterprise. And I'm going to come on to what that might look like. But in essence, it must be an entity that coordinates academia, industry, and government. I note the title, we're focusing on industry tonight, but I really think it's important that those three communities are working in very tight cohesion as a key element of our success. But before I go on to that, I'd like to reflect a little bit on what has worked well in the past. Reasons to be hopeful, if you like. So as David said, I've been knocking around the UK space sector for a little while now. And I remember a program called the Mosaic program, which was right back in the sort of 2000s. I think it was conceived before then. And in a nutshell, it was a moment in time when the significance of small satellite technology was recognized. Now, the reason I point to that program is it is a very, very hopeful reminder of when, as a community, we chose priorities, we backed winners, and we did it across the civil and defence communities. It was truly a joined-up partnership, and I think that's where we will need to head. And actually, BNSE had a lot wrong with it. Lord Drayson's just outlined a few things, had a few things right with it, too. And actually, the way in which it was structured with secondees from defence communities, secondees from the industrial community, sitting side by side, enabled a lot more coordination than might have been apparent from the outside. Now, all very well. Sometimes that coordination from the defence community was a bit of a nod and a wink. You know, you might be discussing whether or not we should invest in a particular technology, and it's a bit of a frown from the other side of the table with a subtle shake of the finger. And you'd know that probably there was some defence investment going into that area already, and it wasn't wise to use civil funds on that. But, you know, it was there. It did work. Again, already alluded to, I think what has worked well through the establishment of the UK Space Agency, through bringing together some rather disparate budgets, has been that international influence, particularly in our interaction with ESA. Lord Drayson is, of course, absolutely right. It's incredibly difficult for the UK to be impactful if we were constantly, as we were, having to go back and forth to Whitehall to a number of different government departments to understand the funding available and therefore our negotiating position. So that is a really, really strong feature of the structures that we need to keep going forward. And we also had that same join-up, that same coordination across government more recently in 2008 in the development of the Space Industry Act, where a number of different departments really had to lean into that to create that success. So there are reasons to be hopeful. There have been incidences where we have achieved that coordination at scale and at pace across government, across industry, and across academia. Guess what's coming next? There's some areas where that hasn't worked so well. And I'm not going to provide a long list, but there's a few that I would highlight, and they really fall under a general heading of procurement. So whilst our focus has been quite effective on joining up upstream technology development, my sense is we've never been very effective in joining up the use of the data and services from space. Never at pace, never at scale. There's been a few smaller examples. We've had the Space for Smarter Government programme. Wasn't really at scale. We finally had an investment in GHGSat from government. That definitely wasn't at pace. And we had an investment in OneWeb. And I would love us to discuss OneWeb later on the panel because it is so Marmite. There will be people in the audience tonight, love it or hate it. But I would suggest that regardless of your view about the decision itself, what we haven't done is join up the way in which government has used that system. So I do think that there is a lot more to do in that regard. And then let's come to the context today. Pace is our first challenge. We've seen an incredible pace in the development of rocket technology. Of course, the reusable rocket technology has absolutely transformed the type of programs that we have in space now. These are things that are now happening over years, not decades. And this is going to continue. We're going to see the same now in mega constellations that are already there, in the emergence of quantum technologies, AI data processing. All of this is happening very, very quickly. We need to construct ourselves in a way which enables us to respond with pace. Reliance is the context today. We need to make the case that our society is utterly dependent on space. And it sounds very motherhood and apple pie to say that in this room, because I'm sure all of you are already convinced. Believe me, it is not well known outside the space community, and there is a big job there still to be done. Low Earth orbit is the backbone, really, of our digitally enabled society, global society, be that communications, be that navigation, be that our need for climate monitoring, our defence activities, and this is going to increase more and more. And thinking about defence dual use. Dual use is not a new thing, it's been around forever, but dual use is a reality for all of our programmes, at least the vast majority of our programmes. Thermal imaging from space is an example. Of course, the capability that will enable you to, for instance, detect the onset of wildfires early enough to respond effectively is the same capability that will enable you to see activity in warfare. Absolutely nothing to cheer about, but I'm sure that the outbreak of the war in Ukraine enabled many businesses to take off more quickly than they would have done otherwise, because that dual-use capability, that dual-use business model is now established. It isn't just a technology, it's the downstream, it's the business model. Geopolitical uncertainty, I don't really know where to start with that one, apart from the sounds that the King did a very good job just recently. Nonetheless, there remains a remarkable amount of geopolitical uncertainty. Everyone in this room knows that. I don't even know which game we're playing these days, let alone which side we're on, but we definitely need to bring our own ball. And that very much speaks to the point that Lord Drayson was making. We need to bring our own national capability, and that has to withstand the geopolitical storms, that has to withstand the geopolitical winds, because, there is an uncertainty. It has to be agnostic almost to our partner. We just need to be able to bring something to the table. And I'm afraid, international comparators, let's be real. The budgets have increased in the UK, but nothing like at the scale happening elsewhere. It's not really sensible to compare us to the US or China. We're never really going to match those figures. Let's take a more local example. Let's look at Germany. They put over 5 billion into the ESA Ministerial at the end of last year and announced 35 billion, I think it was, or maybe it's 30 billion. It's a really big number into just space defence out until 2035. This is what we're faced with. We certainly haven't had anything that matches that in the UK. So we need to be more clever, right? We need to have no more hubris. It's not helpful to have, catchphrases, sweeping statements about global leadership if we're not putting in place the programs and the funding to back them. We need to be more clever. And this is where I come to a space enterprise. How can we do this? So R&D investment. We need R&D investment programs at scale that deliver across government. We need to be more mosaic, as Mosaic did for small satellite technologies, but we need to choose those areas where we want to have investments at scale. Procurement. Again, we need to pool our requirements, and I want to be really clear about this. This doesn't mean the industry saying, oh, government's got to buy the satellites. It means the industry saying, if government can pool their requirements and show up as a credible anchor tenant for some of the capability, it enables the industry to very effectively leverage the private finance that they need to mobilize the whole system. And that's a very important distinction. It doesn't mean government buys everything. We do it the UK way. But at the moment, we don't have that sense of coordination in our procurement strategies. Finance follows from that. There's a number of measures that we need to take, and I think, kudos to Paul in particular. I think under his leadership at the UK Space Agency, there's been a lot of engagement with the city, a lot of support for businesses in accessing those wider sources of finance. It's going to be absolutely key. And insurance as well. We need to be innovative yet open and transparent to enable industry to give that greater confidence to investors. Regulation. Yes, we need to regulate for the next innovations coming down the line, but we also need to recognise there's a shifting landscape. There is a lot of discussion about the EU Space Act. We're not necessarily at the centre of those discussions, of course, but they are going to have an impact on the UK. We need to be responsive. We need to be adaptable. We need to be operating at pace. And finally, international collaboration, aligning science, trade and security. And a lot of that's motherhood and apple pie. Right? I don't think anything I've said there is controversial. And what's really good about that is it's within grasp, okay? These aren't epically difficult concepts to wrap your head around. And we need to pick priorities. And we've seen some of those priorities emerge from DCIT. We've seen SATCOMs, we've seen launch, we've seen SDA, we've seen ISAMs. And this level of decision-making is tricky, and I think this is the final point I want to leave us with, really. This is difficult stuff. If it was easy to make decisions on priorities, we would have done it all along. It's far more comfortable, isn't it? It's far more comfortable to say we're going to run an open competition and everything's going to be fair and everyone's getting an equal shot. It doesn't work. It really, really doesn't work with the space sector. We have to get bolder. And that requires a shift in culture. It requires us to have some quite difficult conversations. It requires us to disagree without being disagreeable. It requires constructive challenge. And then it requires collaboration. Then it requires us all to get behind the same priorities. And actually, do you know what? I think we're a pretty collaborative sector. So I think we can do that because we're space people and we can do that. I leave you with that thought.
Thank you very much indeed, Alice, for that perspective on things from UK Space. We're now going to hear from Paul Bate, Dr. Paul Bate, who was the Chief Executive of the Space Agency, and I had an excellent time as the Chairman of the Board when he was our Chief Executive. Before that, he has also served in government on life sciences, including as the Life Sciences Advisor at Number 10. He has business experience as well at Babylon. Paul, your reflections on all this, over to you.
Good evening, and thank you very much for this opportunity to get me out of my early retirement. Before I say anything on space policy, I would like to say thank you to all the members of staff of the Space Agency and the Space Directorate who have navigated a particularly difficult 12 months. The Space Agency continues within DCIT, but it is different. And whichever language you want to use for that, that is very difficult to manage. For those who are still in the Space Agency, for those who've moved on to jobs elsewhere in DCIT and beyond. I want to start by saying a very big thank you for the professionalism that everybody has displayed. Now, the challenge I have is I've got to follow Lord Drayson, I've got to follow Alice. So I thought I would ask NASA for some help. Let's take a quick tour of the universe. This is NASA's Cosmic Web simulation. You are flying through a 134 megaparsec block of the cosmos. That's 437 million light years, if you prefer that terminology. And you're traveling currently at around 600 trillion times the speed of light. You are going quite fast. The point here, though, is that each of those white dots is visible matter. Each of those white dots is basically a galaxy. Everything you see in purple, the filament structure, is a simulation of dark matter, the 85% or so of the mass of the universe that is not visible to our telescopes directly or to the naked eye. The point I am trying to make here is that we have a beautiful web, a cosmic web. And I'm going to make the argument in the next few minutes that just as there is a cosmic web, there is also a space policy web. And that web genuinely matters. Because if we don't understand that we are an interconnected web when we're talking about space policy, that it binds research and commercialization, that it traverses civil space and military space and applications, that discovery science is fundamentally linked to operational activity, then we face, I think, the biggest risk. And the risk is this. Governments want outcomes. That's a good thing, want outcomes, a better society. This government has particularly chosen short to medium-term economic growth and national security for the outcomes from space. Good. Those are good outcomes. But if we then take the shortcut, the simplistic answer, that, well, we'll just fund the things that are closest to today's national security and closest to economic growth, then we are going to make a serious error. To every complex problem, there is a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong. We risk breaking fundamental parts of our space sector if we don't understand the ties that bind the space sector together. So the web is complex, we need to go deeper. I'm going to argue for 4 things that we should do to strengthen our space web so that the UK space sector can best benefit the causes of humanity as a whole. So let me start with the point that webs need anchor points. They have to be attached to something. And I'm going to argue there are 2 fundamental anchor points for the UK space sector, and we lose them at our peril. The first is the depth and diversity of our SME base, the small and medium enterprises. We have a little over 1,900 organizations in the space sector. We would not have anything like that number if it weren't for the, can we call it the Drayson-Willett strategy? Whichever the official title is, because it suggested and required us to build a space sector. Sometimes we now hear the argument we have too many, and that somehow we're trying to support them all. That is a fallacy, for what it's worth. I think less than 1/6 of space sector organizations get any space agency funding. I'm sure they'd all love some, but that simply isn't the way it works. That's the first of our anchor points. But the other is our research community, our academic groups and their global excellence. The point is here that we need to maintain the funnel of the SMEs if we're going to grow the scale-ups, which are really at the heart of the government strategy and where the true economic growth comes from. And we need to maintain the research base because it first drives innovation in its own right. It is a complex, deep tech environment space. And quite frankly, because we should be curious about the universe. We should seek to answer the questions that have bugged humanity since we've looked at the stars, which is since ever. And for interesting, that is one thing that I think has worked really well in recent years, has been the willingness to support R&D across the UK, and particularly to invest in infrastructure. So the Space Clusters and Infrastructure Fund, which has already put, I think, £60 million into the space sector. It's one of the most oversubscribed funds that the Space Agency has. I think there have been announcements about its continuation, which I think is an excellent thing. And we know that the payback on that is profound. I think it's particularly important when it is anchored to universities and core companies, which I might come back to. So what's happening up in Northeast Space Skills and Technology Centre is a really good example of that anchoring with Northumbria and with Lockheed Martin. So webs need anchor points. But going back to the point about scale-ups, scale-ups are not big SMEs. Right? It's very easy to sort of plot the course and say, well, if we only had that SME that's doing really well, if it was only 100 times bigger, then wouldn't it be brilliant? Well, that's true of cake, but I'm not sure it's absolutely true of how businesses work. So I think a number of us in the room have grown businesses. I took a business from 100 million to 4 billion in valuation. It went a bit down after that. But I can bear some scars of what it actually takes. It's the job of the founders, of the entrepreneurs, of the execs, to figure out what a genuinely scalable business model is, not just a phenomenal technology. And it is the job of investors, and that includes government funders, to understand what companies they believe are actually capable of making it. And we should tailor our interventions to those companies that we do believe. But it has to be a chosen few. We cannot do that for 1,900 plus organizations. So it is right to invest in the R&D base overall and infrastructure, but we absolutely need to pick a portfolio of companies most likely to scale. And they will probably ones that have scaling built into their business model, not ones that are now thinking about how they scale once they've developed their technology. Now, the Innovate UK prospectus that came out recently, I think absolutely gets this spot on. And we have another advantage that we've started the Unlocking Space for Business and for Investment program 3+ years ago. And we can now extend that to holistically support that small number of companies. It's going to be R&D grants, it's going to be government contracts, as Alice said, and it's going to be balance sheet investments. But the point is, it won't be the same prescription for every company. You have to understand the company and agree whether government intervention will be over time if the company stays on its trajectory. That, I think, is the fundamental give and get of a program like that. Thirdly, capabilities really matter. I'm not just saying that because Mark is in the room, who runs the capabilities program. They do matter, but specificity matters too. Perhaps it even matters more. And what we've seen, I think, in the policy documentation over the last few years, we go back to the 2021 National Space Strategy, which, for those of you who remember it, had 5 ambitions and 4 pillars. So the things that supported the ambitions, one of those was space capabilities. It's not a new concept. I mean, it goes back well before 2021, of course. But what has somewhat happened, it seems to me, is that capabilities have become posited as the sole answer or the primary driver to all policy intervention. Now, I think we absolutely need highly assured national capabilities, and they're actually being set out in policy documentations as well. We need that for our own national security. We need to know the things this country needs to protect itself and play its part with its allies on national security and defence. What I don't think we need so much of, and I'm not absolutely sure that governments could do it even if they wanted to, is to predict which capabilities drive economic growth. In other words, national security and economic growth can be complementary, but they are not the same thing. And simply hoping that the thing that you do on economic growth will drive national security or vice versa is just too simplistic in its thinking. It's markets, it's customers, investors, and suppliers, businesses that drive growth. But they do so in an incredibly complex, interconnected, multi-sectoral world. And it isn't one person saying one thing. It's the context, it's the invisible hand of the market that really does select out the products and the services that best fit need. I don't think that's something that we can accurately predict. So if we had to pick something, I'd pick a government-wide space technology roadmap, specifically outlining the technologies that we're going to invest in as a country, and I would do so over re-articulating a kind of more dogmatic approach to capabilities all good or some such. Finally, that space web, that is not a web just across the UK. Space is just about the most global endeavour because everybody's in almost all orbits. You move relative to the Earth for the geosynchronous community. Clearly it's not true for geosynchronous 33,000 kilometres above, or whatever it is. But pretty much everyone has a border with space. And on the one hand, if we're going to play well internationally, that means we have to nurture the very best, deepest relationships we have. And at least at agency level, that is ESA and that is NASA, with no disrespect to any other space agency, of which I think there are around 90. But ESA are our closest. Obviously, we are a founding member, and NASA are simply the largest civil space agency by an absolute mile. And we have strong relationships, historically relationships built by individual universities and, to some extent, organisations, but increasingly government to government and agency to agency. So we need to foster those, but we also need to foster those middle power country relationships, the things that Mark Carney has talked so much about, which we've done well, I think, recently. I think we therefore need to move further towards valuing our bilateral missions, our big international missions, our multinational missions, and see those as markers of success in space. And I mean at a government level, not just at country level. Actually, in government, we should value the fact that we are intrinsic parts of some of the biggest missions, that we will put a rover on the surface of Mars leaving in 2028, look for past life. We will hopefully be an intrinsic part of Habitable Worlds Observatory, just in the way that we were an intrinsic part of the James Webb Space Telescope. But all too often it's the opposite. You have a lack of control when you are part of a partnership. Not everybody can do everything they want all the time. And I think sometimes for colleagues in the Treasury, it's a little bit challenging to know that you can't just pull out on, if the numbers change. It's deeply important in space to be decadal if you want to foster those international relationships. And we learn that at our peril at ESA, if we get that one wrong. But it's not just about playing well internationally to playing with others. It's also about setting out what our global niches should be. We have to bring something to the party. And I just want to take one example, and that is our work to date, and I hope our work in future, on space sustainability, where we have been world leading. We have supported the United Nations Office on Outer Space Affairs and many others in developing the guidelines. We've been in the vanguard of space sustainability. The whole of this week, the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee, which is the sort of global committee including the UK, the US, China, Russia, Ukraine, and others, are getting together in Harwell because the UK is chairing the IADC this year. And there was a talk on Monday about atmospheric ablation, so what happens at the end of life when a satellite is deorbited. We see that as the right way to end the satellite's life, right? In the space community, that's a lot safer than letting it continue around, and particularly colliding or fragmenting. But each 750 kilogram satellite deposits metal oxide into the upper atmosphere and into the stratosphere, and the impact on ozone depletion is estimated at the equivalent to 250,000 cars emissions annually, each satellite. Just to give a comparison, in April, 4 satellites deorbited each day. So just leave that. That's the scale of ozone depletion that it looks like we are going to have to cope with. You can do the numbers. No one wants to kind of work out in their heads. There are 1.6 billion cars in the world. But my point is that whilst anyone could choose to take a leadership position, the UK is very well positioned to do so. We have the space sustainability heritage, and when it comes to avoiding collisions and the Kessler syndrome, the chain reaction of collisions leading to orbits being impossible to utilize, the reality is that about half a dozen mega constellations, half of which will be in the US, half of which will be in China, are going to dominate low Earth orbit. And it's very difficult for those two countries to work together for obvious reasons. So creating the platform in which the right people can come together, the policymakers, the companies, investors. I think it's a really interesting and important role that the UK should play. It would carve out a global niche for us if we did. So let me, in summary, come back to those purple filaments. Space is as deceptive as it is beautiful. It needs to be understood deeply to understand its future. That goes for the cosmic web, and it goes for the policy web. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And that point about the potential damage done by satellites burning up in the atmosphere, very powerful indeed. We're now going to hear from Professor David Parker. Dave was one of the people who was involved in creating the space agency. He was working for it when it first set up in 2010, and indeed then became the chief executive in 2013. After which he then moved on to the European Space Agency as Director of Human and Robotic Exploration. And most recently, he has been serving on the board of the Space Agency again. So for me, during my time as Minister, I worked closely with Dave, both as a senior member of the Space Agency team and then as the Chief Executive. And as we reflect on the changes, we've talked very starkly about the difference between the arm's length body and now the new arrangements. But the space agency itself changed a lot. After 2010, we were strongly backing it. If anything, it grew. And I remember the Department of Transport didn't seem that interested in Galileo, and we incorporated Galileo and transport responsibilities into our space agency in BEIS. And I remember one of the senior officials in BEIS who had the space agency budget as one of his responsibilities, saying to me subsequently, well, I had one of the officials in the science and technology team. He was doing the space agency, and he also did STFC, and the space agency seemed to be working fine. We probably had half time of one official working on space and space agency. We left it to the space agency. You and Dave Parker seemed to get on fine. And I remember Dave used to come around to my office and we used to talk about policy and we used to talk about practicalities, and that was the model. By the time of the space agency's arm's length body coming to an end and its incorporation into DCIT, there are different estimates, but there were approximately 70 policy officials in DCIT in doing a policy role and in a permanent state of negotiation and exchange with an arm's length body that was supposedly in an operational role. And that was a recipe for excess bureaucracy. And I am a believer, therefore, in a single entity. The single entity is now going to be a single entity in DCIT. Paul set out a very powerful vision of a single entity as the space agency, which was how Dave and I operated. But either of those models is better than the model where you try to make a distinction between something called policy and something called operation, when in reality, in a high-tech environment like space, that is a distinction that doesn't really work. So, for me, Dave is an embodiment of the way in which Paul's model can work, and we very much look forward to your observations, Dave. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. As David has kind of hinted, I've reached the end of my time working for ESA, the end of my time on the board of the UK Space Agency, the end of my time as working in the sector. So I'm rather spending a lot of time looking backwards and reflecting and waking up in the middle of the night and going, I wish we'd done that. What I want to do is give a little bit of a professory talk on the past in order to help the people who are going to build the future take some lessons from the past and pull out what worked, what didn't work, what could be done better in the future. I naturally tend to feel that the time when I was running the space agency, it was all fantastic and everything else was terrible. No, not true at all. Paul has achieved some amazing things. And yes, BNSE before delivered some amazing things. And I wanted to credit that in particular. Now, two famous people I wanted to refer to. These are two of the things I say all the time to myself and to anybody who listens to me. Two famous thinkers. Anybody know who they are? Okay. So George Friedrich Hegel always said, what we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. Who's the person about my lifetime, one of the greatest thinkers? Well, it's Douglas Adams, of course, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And my favourite quote, you know, it's at times like this, I wish I'd listened to what my mother told me when I was young. Arthur Dent, what for prefix said, what did she tell you? I don't know, I didn't listen. So hoping that one or two nuggets of what I say today may help the future. I'm not going to canter in the detail through the history of the UK in space. I have it here because it's the sort of talk I do. I'm going to pull out maybe just one point on here. Diamond A. Who knows what Diamond A is? The rocket that launched the first European satellite on the first European rocket. Oh, it was French. French space policy was established very clearly 60 years ago and boils down to we're going to be number one in Europe and we're going to invest proportionate to GDP, the same as the Americans, to ensure we're number one. Same space policy for the past 60 years, you could argue. Nuanced and turned into programs and so on. But steadiness of purpose and direction is an important thing. Yes, the UK launched its own satellite on its own rocket in 1971, but we haven't done it since. Are we going to do it again in the future? I don't know. It seems less likely than it did a little while ago. Does it matter? I don't know. 1986 is where this chart comes to an end because it's the two things. The point where Europe became a world-class player in planetary science by intercepting Halley's Comet. NASA wasn't there. The Europeans did it. It was exactly at the moment when something called the British National Space Centre was being formed. And it's why I dug out my little gold badge, a BNSE badge, to be able to wear it, because the opportunities don't come up very often. So a word about BNSE and what it was, the good and the bad things about it that Alice has hinted at. There's a voluntary partnership of government departments and research councils. It had a space board that sat above it, chaired by one of the partners on a rotating basis. Industry, some delivery partners were involved in that. There were 50 people. I went there on secondment in 1997 for 2 years from industry. About a third of my career has been spent in industry, a third in the UK public sector, and a third as an international civil service servant working for ESA. And that time when I was seconded into the BNSC was interesting for me. But I went back there in 2004 when there were, again, about 50 people there. Very important, when BNSC was set up, the terms of reference, the MOD insisted that they had the number 2 there. DTI had the number 1 position, the Director General, but the Deputy Director General had to be from the MOD to ensure join-up across the civil-military dual-use domain. I'm amazed in recent year or two when I've been back in the UK, I've talked to lots of MOD space people who have no idea that every single generation of UK military telecom satellite was developed through funding through the European Space Agency, the platform, the spacecraft. The connections have been lost, and I think I know why that happened. But there was this join up with the research councils, with the Met Office, and with industry. There are always industry secondees working inside BNSC. And there's, little me at the back there with Lord Sainsbury. There always seems to be lords who run space policy. He seems to do a good job. Back in 2005, the first of 7 ESA ministerials for me. I'll rush. I don't want to go through all of the detail on this, but to just say that the history was one of early hope. Roy Gibson came back from the European Space Agency, developed an ambitious plan for space activities in the UK. It was never really considered by the cabinet of Mrs. Thatcher. He left. There was a focusing down on 3 things. We'd already been doing space science. We'd already been doing telecommunications, SATCOM. That time, UK was number 1 in SATCOM in Europe. The additional thing was Earth observation. Very important recognition that Earth observation was going to be scientifically important, but important for understanding the planet and what we as human beings are doing for it. By the by, the last commercial telecom satellite led from the UK was launched in 1995. I checked that today, fully commercial one. So there was a focusing down, but also an industrial consolidation where the industrial power British Aerospace was the biggest space company in Europe in the 1970s and 80s, was sold, merged with French companies, merged with German companies. And the sovereignty of our industrial capabilities started to be diluted, an important point. Beagle 2 I wanted to highlight because back at the end of the 1990s, it brought UK industry, academia and government together on a single integrated project. Companies that really didn't like working together started working together, and they discovered actually they had a common interest and some common goals. I think this is a very important moment that shouldn't be forgotten. But the Space Agency, thanks to Lord Drayson, did come into existence in 2010. But I wanted to highlight that Alice has identified one thing that BNSC was able to do very well. The partnership structure was also able to do some policy work in that framework that wouldn't otherwise have happened, including changing the UK stance on human spaceflight, which was firmly against and became positive through a set of policy work through the 2000s. And again, I pulled out an old document to just say, in my view, the high-level vision of a civil space policy hasn't fundamentally changed in 20 years in terms of the real objectives. It worries me that the deliver world-leading exploitation of space systems for managing our changing planet is apparently not as important as it was, because the planet is changing even faster than we thought it was back then. And so that element is critical for space policy. I think the agency has many successes in its first 10 years, but I wanted to highlight what David Willetts achieved by the 25% funding increase in ESA in 2012. Because that was, of all the different things I think we did, that had a global impact. The shockwave spread out not just across Europe, but across the Atlantic, because we saw an inward investment. Companies on almost a weekly basis in 2013 were coming to us to explore how they might establish a presence in the UK. So ESA is not just about giving money to somebody and then they take it away. It's about what it creates back home. Really important. We can identify other successes, but I wanted, and I think, to just highlight one great success about the join-up between policy, regulation, and program in a very small organization, whilst maintaining the connections to other relevant organizations. When I sat as head of UK Space Agency in Swindon, I turned left out of the door to go and talk to the head of STFC. I turned right out of the door to go and talk to the head of NERC. And I crossed the road to talk to the head of Innovate UK. And keeping those close connections with the other delivery organizations, partners in the UK space scene, I think was really important. The thing I would highlight as the biggest weakness was this loss of connection with the MOD. So the head of technology had always been from the Ministry of Defence. As that connection was lost, and particularly as, and people forget about it, the RAE Farnborough Space Department was lost, so sold off, privatised. The MOD somehow lost a strength in the underpinning technology, so it was difficult to have a conversation. The importance of space IGS has been mentioned already, so I won't emphasise it, other than here was a very clear plan of stuff to do that was agreed by industry, academia, and government, and let's get on with it step by step. And there was an organisation to oversee it, the Space Leadership Council, where government sat next to industry. Andy Green sat next to David Willetts and held me and others to account. And the number one of action of that was to create the National Space Policy, which pulled together across government all the organisations that were involved in space, set out their relative responsibilities, whilst giving the agency the explicit responsibility for delivering civil programs covering policy, regulation, and delivery. And that included, after my time in 2018, doing primary legislation through Parliament for space launch in the UK, and negotiating on very sensitive issues. So where are we now? Let me go from the global to the European to the UK. As Alice has hinted at, incredible pace of technical and commercial developments in space. It's even more important than it was. And there is this shift away from international cooperation to some extent and towards national competition. And we have to recognize that there are kind of governments are helping create de facto commercial monopolies enabled by government investment, one way or another. without being specific. And then we have the challenge that space is a place of potential or actual warfare. And as has been hinted, Europe is resurgent. When I was working at ESA, they always referred to the Brits as those people on the island. Pay attention. Pay attention. The convergence of the Eastern European Commission SATCOMs, navigation, surveillance programs into a system of systems is a very important step. Yet, Germany's 35 billion space plan, the German government came in a year ago, they've already placed 10 billion of orders for new space systems with completely different procurement mechanisms, a pitch process across the table, convince us that you can do something that we need. Great, you've got a contract, here's the X billion. Can we do that kind of procurement in the UK? I think that's what Alice was hinting at. And we're back, it amazes me, to this question, is space important? Do people in government, in policy, in business, in industry as a whole fully understand how space is impacting the economy? It seems like we're back in having those conversations yet again, as if it's something new. But I want to emphasize in all of this, in raising some challenges on the right-hand side, that there are many, many, many positives, and particularly I've seen, being on the board of the agency, how much has been going on in recent years. So I don't want to debate this. Here I just brainstorm with myself for 2 minutes, 10 ideas of things to do on the to-do list. My crazy idea is a national space policy advisor sitting in Cabinet Office that sits above all these warring departments, all these different cooperating departments and ensures they work together. But I want to draw attention to what I saw firsthand, US space policy under Scott Pace, where there were discrete national policy decisions and announcements made one at a time over a period of 2 or 3 years that moved US space policy forward in commercial, in nuclear, in science, in all sorts of different areas. They did not attempt to put everything into one giant document because that inevitably led to the slowest part of the team drives the release of the document. Do it things one thing at a time. So, take actions that unify and not divide is my recommendation. And there's plenty of references for background for what I've been talking about. Thank you very much.
You're staying up here. Take your place. Very good. Well, what fascinating contributions we have already had. Now, I have got some questions online, but let's start with inviting contributions from people here. I see there is a club of former science and space people here, and it's great to see them. And why don't we start with Ian? Everybody do identify yourselves and give your organisation, and then we will collect a couple and move straight down to the two here. Yeah.
Ian Taylor, and a great historical analysis, but can I take you even back further into the mid-90s when I was Minister of Science, Technology and Space? There was an incident which is a warning signal. Corporations noticed this. I'm managing about 200 million through BNSC, the space budget in those days. And I was called in by William Woolgrove, who was Chief Secretary, and told that the DTI's budget was going to have to be cut, and the whole of the space budget would go with it. So that 200 million would be wiped out, regardless of the implications. Now, fortunately, I prevented that with the help of the Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Heseltine, who was a space fan, and still is, by the way. But that just indicates the problem of one departmental budget. Even though BNSC had links in to other departments, and actually that was a problem that was resolved only because of personal relationships with individual ministers in those departments who fought for our cause in it. So I just made that point, that this is a dangerous move to go back in. And my question, David, sorry to take time, my question is how would the acquisition of access to seen Amazon Web Services taking over Globalstar. Very critical low Earth orbit access to spectrum. Where is that now residing?
Right, thank you. Let's collect two more interventions at the front here. Yep.
Thank you, Nick. I'm a pre-C consultant. I'd like to go a bit further back than the 90s and back to the 1960s when, in the midst of the space race and before man stood on the moon, Airey Neave stood up in Parliament and argued that satellites would become the dominant global communications enabler. He called for a satellite program with cabinet-level urgency, and even repurposing the UK's will then cancel ballistic missile program as a sovereign launch. We didn't follow that path. More recently, we tried and failed sort of a sovereign launch through companies like Orbex, which recently collapsed. And we look wider in the space world. You know, we secured a stake in OneWeb, but that now sits in a French headquartered, state-backed company. So my question to the panel is, I mean, are we really serious about sovereign space capacity, and or are we accepting sort of a bit part player in the space race?
Right, okay, and pass the microphone forward. Yep.
Al Gill from the Iceland Space Agency. Very simple-minded question. What's a space agency for? Are you procurement? Are you government VC investment? Are you a research council? What's a space agency for?
Right. No, I think I'm going to start with Paul Drayson and move along. And when it reaches me, I'll answer the specific question about where the spectrum responsibility lies. In fact, I'll answer it now. The answer is Minister Lloyd is the minister who has responsibility for that and is also the minister responsible for space. And Paul can tell you what a space agency is for. Paul Drayson, you start.
To provide clarity across government in the implementation of its policy in a very important area for the nation across civil and defence. As a former minister has already mentioned, the problem inside government is having the mechanisms to have visibility as to what the priorities are and how they are going to be implemented, which can be sustained through political change. Where our government system tends to go wrong is where we need to make decisions for the long term, but we have a political system which it basically incentivizes ministers not to take those decisions. That is why in areas like space, you need the longevity of decision-making, you need clear accountability, and therefore you need a point where everybody can see, whether that's industry or the research base, where that responsibility lies. And you need a minister, ideally more than one minister, who really cares about it.
Alice, your observations?
And yes, and I think actually Dave's identification of having a national space advisor in number 10 can be quite helpful, because ultimately, I mean, my point earlier is all of what we do in space is dual use now. I mean, practically everything we do is dual use. And we have a system where we don't yet, I can't see yet how the departments responsible for civil space activity and the department responsible for defence space activity are going to effectively coordinate without some kind of higher authority to force that coordination a priori. So not after the event, but force that coordination in typically the run-up to spending review cycles. I also wanted to pick up on your question about, are we going to be a bit player? Yes and no. I don't think it's right to say that we're going to lead everything. I think it's just not sensible. Can we select areas where we have truly global leadership? Absolutely we can. And that requires that tricky, collaboration and joining up of priorities. Good example, space weather. I think we've got a really, really strong academic community. We've got a strong operational forecasting ability through the Met Office, 10 years at the MOSWOC. We lead the space weather program through ESA, and we partner with the US with their L1 mission and our L5 mission. So there are areas where you can absolutely, in all credibility, say we lead. And I think the trick is to get those decadal
funding cycles, the decadal commitments to make sure that we retain those leadership across those priority areas.
Yeah, and I'd make one comment following on from what Paul and Alice have said. To some extent, the job of Science Minister is to extract money from the Treasury, and everything else is a bonus and a bit of self-indulgence. But what you really have to do for the sector is extract money from the Treasury. When you look at the Treasury's, setting aside the amount of the exact volume, the Treasury's ideal space budget is discretionary grants to British business that can be turned on and off in accordance with fiscal circumstances. What they really dislike is any long-term commitments. That's why deep tech is so hard in the UK. And it's why, oddly enough, and here I disagree with Paul, although having the arm's length body was a fantastic thing, really what guarantees you long-term funding for deep tech projects is international treaties. And it is partnership with other countries through treaties that helps provide a framework where the costs of withdrawal are much higher. And it's quite interesting. NASA, if you have this conversation with NASA will say they love ESA because when Congress every year is adjusting their budget, it's much harder for Congress when you say we have a treaty obligation, we have a legal partnership, we have a treaty with ESA, we're committed to do these things, we can't just turn them off. So it's ESA and it's international engagement, long-term contracts, which are the very good way of securing a type of budget which the Treasury inherently dislikes. And you then have a trade-off. Often, you can get, if you accept a lower level, you can get more long-term commitment. If you want a lot of money, it tends to be short-term. And I think that so the dynamism of the ESA money is partly that it is around long-term commitments, and there were a range of ideas around ESA budget commitments last time, and I think there were enormous financial pressures, which meant that we withdrew from truths. But withdrawing from truths at that stage was a sort of indicator that I think has created subsequent issues that we are still tackling. Paul, do you want to comment on the particularly what the Space Agency is for?
Yes, I can do that. Just to the point about the bit player point, though, globally we invest around about 1% of the total amount of money that goes into civil space, for which we have 5% of the global market, 1% in, 5% out. That is pretty good. We are, I think, currently ranking fourth, I would say it's fourth or fifth, globally in terms of countries for attracting private capital into our space sector. So we're definitely not a bit player, and certainly on the research and academic side, we're ranking second in the world, second or third. So, on that, what should a space agency do? Well, the purpose, first, there are many space agencies and many things that they do, and NASA is not CNES, is not DLR, is not ASI, is not ISRO, is not the UK Space Agency. So you have choice. You have choice about what you choose to focus on. The UK, certainly under my tenure, we set out our purpose very clearly. We said it was to boost UK prosperity, to understand the universe, and to protect the planet and outer space. That was the point of us, and we chose to achieve it through our role, which was to catalyse investment, not just to shove money in and get technology back, but to get a major multiple from other sources as a consequence, to catalyse investment, to deliver missions and capabilities ourselves and in partnership, and to champion space. And championing meant everything from a 10-year-old girl in Mansfield through to a 50-year-old banker in the city. That was the purpose, that was the role. I think that's what an agency should do.
Thank you. Dave? Yep.
Okay, I think I agree with all the above, but to try and give nuanced answers, where is the UK? I think we have some outstanding capabilities, and Paul has hinted at the science side. Put the two questions together. I used to say that we were a 21st century space agency, by which I meant a space economic development agency, rather focused and nimble was the word David always used to use, which was a way of saying we didn't have many staff. So we had to focus on the things that really mattered, that would really make a difference. With 50 people running, in today's terms, 450, 500 million budget, you had to make tough choices. But the simple message that we had a growth target, we wanted to reach a certain size of industry by 2030, was very simple to understand for everybody. It did not mean that we were abandoning science, because coming from the Research Council world, I would very much say, and the point of investment in science is a long-term bet on creating new knowledge, new technologies along the way, which will have an economic value that you can't describe, because when Hertz was looking at electromagnetic spectrum, he wasn't imagining mobile phones. The benefit from science investment comes back over the long term, and you balance that with short-term investments on telecoms. Next year, you'll place a contract for some new telecoms technology. Where is the UK now? I think we have to be honest. There's a Premier League of space powers, and I think we have to talk about space powers, because that's where the world we're in now, ever more so. There's the US and China, clearly. We're never going to be in that league. Then there is the Premier League, the first division, if you like, and that's Japan, France, Germany, Korea, India, Russia, and then the UK. So we are in range of capabilities, what we can offer to the world, what we have in orbit as a nation, slightly below Italy. And I think in setting a target for the future, the recognition of what is a space power has to be part of the mix of objectives that we define, because if you don't know what you're aiming for, you never know whether you're going to get there.
Thank you very much. We've had some questions put in from our online participants, and I'm just going to take the top 3 or 4 that have been upvoted the most. And I'm going to start, actually the first one is particularly for Alice, but I'll read out some others as well. For Alice Bunn, what is the space enterprise you described? How does it differ from the regrettably totally useless space partnership? That's the first question. The next question, and I don't know why, I don't know, people have got it in for them. The second question is, what was the secret source of the innovation and growth team, people delivering that strategy, versus the current incarnation, the space partnership? I don't know why they're getting a tough time today, but that was the second question. And then I'm going to add a couple more, which are very pertinent. Could the panel comment on the importance of public engagement? NASA is the most popular government agency in the US, whereas most Brits don't know about UK Space Agency. And then the final one is, all speakers have mentioned cross-government relationships and coordination. What metrics should we use to measure the ambition and delivery of the one government approach? So, Alice, we'll start with you and then go to Paul Drayson, but especially that first one.
Yeah,
or this
good.
issue about the space partnership, which seems to have a tough time just now.
Oh, I was going to answer space enterprise.
Okay.
Space partnership. But, I mean, ultimately, a space enterprise, I wasn't particularly specific, but I talked about the function, and it's an ability to respond at scale and at pace in a coordinated cross-government way. We've heard about the one government approach. I think that's very welcome words. I am yet to understand how that's going to work in practice. Mm-hmm. And I'm yet to understand how that's going to work in practice when you have policy responsibilities in different departments. Again, fundamentally, I think there's a big role for DCIT and MOD to demonstrate how we can make the most of our investment in space. And it's probably a question for Cabinet Office Number 10 or Treasury to identify how they can provide that forcing function, because it is essentially a forcing function, I think, to make sure that we do all align behind the same priorities and make sure that we get the biggest bang for our buck.
And actually, that's a good moment for Paul, because your model was a civil model. And it is interesting that in Dave Parker's account of BNSC, with the deputy being an MOD appointee, tell how you had worked in MOD. You were an MOD minister as well. Just tell us how you find the civil defence partnership and the extent to which the space agency, as you envisage it, could make that connection.
So I think the historical context is really important, because the space agency was born out of responding to a global financial crisis. And we had a prime minister at the time who not only was grappling with dealing with the near-term financial crisis, but he decided that what he needed was a science and innovation minister in the cabinet who was doing things to help prevent the collapse of the science-based enterprise across the country in those areas where the UK really had critical mass, potential to grow in the future. It was basically my job was to do everything we could do to make sure that those sectors like life sciences and like space survived. So the partnership with, it was partly, Andy Green's leadership, but it was partly because there was an urgency. And that presented both focus, but also the space to make decisions and to have ministerial accountability. And so I can remember going to ministerial and basically coming back and getting rather told off by number 10 by some of the things which I did to negotiate with ESA at the time. But I had clarity as to what my job was, and I had the power, if you like, to do it. I think the difficulty we've got now is we've got a crisis that's a geopolitical and economic crisis. We've got frankly, a bloated civil service as a result of COVID, and we do not have, it seems, the ability to take tough decisions around prioritization, about procurement quickly, because the crisis is moving, if you like, too slowly. The crisis that took place around 2009 was happening so quickly, you had to take action fast, and that forced ministers to lead and take decisions and to require civil servants to come up with solutions. And I think we need a bit of that now.
Was the MOD part of that?
No, it wasn't.
Dave, your observations on that?
Yeah, I mean, the contrast between the IGS and Space Partnership couldn't be more stark. The IGS was really industry and academia and industry and government coming together and say, this is, we have an objective we want to reach. These are specific 16 actions. We're going to do this one by one, and we're going to tick them off. And we're going to hold each other to account for it. So I was one of the people that felt the weight, not just of the minister, but also of industry on my shoulders. Whereas my sense of the Space Partnership is asking everybody what you'd like to do, and you end up with kind of the lowest common denominator of the statement of, yeah, we'd like to do space satcoms. Well, that's the biggest sector of the space industry, so yes, of course. But yes, there are wars happening, yes, there's a security crisis, but climate change doesn't care about human beings. The physics is still happening, and so that is going to have enormous impact on policy one way or another, and space has a contribution to make to that. So yeah, I think they're two very different things. But the MOD thing, as I say, was partially at the time, the MOD had, as it were, privatised its main space programme through Skynet 5, through the Paradigm thing, and so wasn't as strong a player across the table. I remember trying to have...
Also the context that the MOD was dealing with two wars at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Iraq and Afghanistan, and so therefore focus was, elsewhere.
But I would emphasise, I felt sometimes I was being held to account also by Cabinet Office of Space, whether as a cross-cutting issue where the Cabinet Office Minister, Oliver Letwin, I think, was challenging me, but also colleagues from other departments and saying, how are you going to work together? How are you going to tackle this particular challenge? That's great.
Mm-hmm. Paul, do you want to comment on that and also on this issue of the profile of NASA?
Well, I was thinking about what you said about the job of a science minister is to get the money from the Treasury. And I was wondering if the job of a space agency chief exec is to deliver a successful ESA ministerial. And I only say that partly in jest, because it's 70% of all the money typically going out the door. So I did 2 of those. And I think it's an interesting test for the future about whether the one government approach works, whether the bringing the space agency within DCIT is working, is what Seaman 28 is going to be looking like. And it's a challenging fiscal situation. What I would say, in the 2 that I did with George, who's in the audience, in 22, and with Liz Lloyd just last November. In both those cases, those ministers, and I think it was the same for both of you, had real autonomy, I felt, to make decisions and the choice as to how much they wanted to follow the kind of official line or do other things. I think that's deeply important. And those ministers deeply concentrate their mind. On the NASA point, well, NASA has a $22 billion budget, so that helps. But they also put people on the moon, and that helps. So I think the reason why they're known is because they fundamentally put to rest, I suspect, the argument as to who was the stronger geopolitical power out of the US and the Soviet Union, or at least that had salience. But
that point, I think, is really important. So the profile of space to the general public is absolutely vital to the national interest. And what happened with me was that I got the call to appoint me as science minister when I was in America at the time. I was motor racing. And I was told I was going to get interviewed by the Guardian newspaper as soon as I woke up the next morning, because I was in the States. And I hadn't been properly briefed. And the Guardian newspaper journalist said to me, "Do you think we should have a British astronaut?" And I went, "Yeah, of course we should have a British astronaut." And then I got a phone call from number 10 going, "You know that isn't government policy." And I didn't know it wasn't government policy.
Why would you?
But right, but I then had a fight on my hands. I had the responsibility to fix that because I basically got a bit of a splash that the UK was going to have its own astronaut. And so I made sure I delivered it. I'm serious. That is exactly what happened. And basically, I'd put myself in a position where I was asked a question, "Do you believe in something as a minister?" And I gave a truthful answer. And then number 10 said to me, "Well, you better negotiate with ESA for us to be able to have," and you were there at the time, which was about getting ESA to invest in Harwell in return for us putting forward our contribution to have an astronaut. It was a negotiation.
Absolutely, and it shows how stories, the myths, sort of become more important than reality, because a previous Labour space minister had already said, "Yes, I think we should have astronauts." That was Malcolm Wicks in 2007 in the Times, black and white. But the story that the UK didn't do human spaceflight was kind of reflected back at you, even though a previous minister had already expressed the view.
Can I go on that point on stories for a second, and NASA in particular. NASA run an annual survey. Why should the US taxpayer invest in NASA? And every year, the same answer comes out. What the top reason to invest in NASA has nothing to do with space telescopes, has nothing to do with landing on Mars, has nothing to do with going to the moon. The number one reason is to avoid an asteroid wiping out the Earth. That is what it is. Now, that is actually a perfectly legitimate thing to be worried about. But it is fundamentally because of the stories that Hollywood tells.
Yeah.
It is the result of phenomenal science fiction that has entered the public consciousness, and NASA goes hand in hand with that. So perhaps we need a bit less Blake 7 and a bit more, UK focus on those sorts of stories.
But I really want to give an answer, which is I don't think it matters whether people have heard of the UK Space Agency. I would be much happier.
Thank heavens for that.
Because they don't. I would be much happier if they knew which were the 3 top UK space companies and what they did for the economy. Because if in the press, in the continent, that's everywhere. The space as an industry is being discussed day in, day out, and where it's going and who's up and who's down and who's merging with whom. Sadly, space is still covered in a lot of press in the UK as a science topic. Sorry, Pallav, but that's the history of it. Yeah, and we had some fantastic science journalists discussing space, but the consequence is it's not seen as a business.
Right.
Can I just one word on this? Because I do think, the NASA Communications Department has got the easiest job in the world. Not only have they got massive budgets, but they do the bit of space that everyone knows about already. It's a far more thorny problem to try and convey the bit of space that people don't understand, even though they have sat navs in their car. They don't get that sat is satellite, and so on, and so on, and so on. So I just wanted to make one point just to start an argument, really. So I'm going to say it and then duck and then explain. I don't think it's a bad thing that the Space Agency has moved into DSIT. Duck. The reason is, you know, space is everything, right? Mm-hmm. There's a spectrum of space activities. Yep. There is the discovery of black holes, there is the missions to the moon, there is the daring do that everybody knows about, all the way through to space being just a bit boring infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And that bit of boring infrastructure story is the story that is damn hard to tell, but a much more important story to tell. And I think it is very difficult to tell that story from an arm's length body, but you stand a much better chance of telling that story if you're in a central government department.
Well, and thank you for making that point. And certainly also, we should absolutely hope and expect that the new arrangement could work. And as I said, I've seen close up the amount of wasteful communication caused by two different bodies trying to exchange email. Now we've got a lot of people intervening. There is a club of ex-ministers here, and George Freeman's been trying to intervene. We're going to hear George and then Palab. George.
Great, thank you, David. I don't know what the collective noun for former space ministers is. A black
constellation.
Hole or a constellation.
Thank you.
But it's great to be here. Thank you for a brilliant evening. One suggestion, could you offer a briefing as a group, and I'd happily join you, to every space minister as they take office? Because it's a weird process. I was appointed on a Thursday night and I launched the strategy on Monday. I read it over the weekend and it was clear to me that it was a wonderful document, but it wasn't a strategy. It was a prospectus for some things we could do, and the strategy would be to choose which ones to do in which order.
And when.
I want to ask about Europe and OneWeb. It's all too raw for me. As you know, I battled for 10 years since Brexit, having been schooled by David, inspired by Paul, to try and deliver long-term science policy while my party ate itself. And it's pretty bruising. But of all of the things I was most shocked and upset about was OneWeb. I inherited this extraordinary asset, done in a pretty dodgy way by Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson in a smoke-filled room. The Treasury were unhappy. But nonetheless, I looked and thought, hang on, as the world builds constellations, there's only going to be 2 or 3. We've got a controlling stake. Amazing asset. It was very clear to me quickly that Treasury wanted nothing to do with it and wanted to get rid of it as quickly as they could. And I watched the slow car crash of it being handed over to Europe. My question is it too late? Because I watched Thierry Breton exclude me and the Swiss and the others who were non-members of the EU from ESA conversations for core members and push back hard and set up a little group of non-EU members of ESA. I think ESA is a great organisation, and I wanted to thank you, Paul and Dave, for everything you've done. But I look at the defence surge and think, hang on, as Poland builds the artillery and Germany the tanks and France the nuclear, isn't our role to be the SATCOM's integrator of battlefield operations? It supports our special relationship with Washington. Isn't this a moment where we could be the SATCOM's integrator at the heart of the European battlefield? And is it too late? Could we turn OneWeb still into a vehicle for UK to be right at the heart of the European space economy?
That is a great question. And Palab, but let's hear from you as well.
Thank you, David. Sorry not to be a former science minister, although I have worked with all of you. Just to speak to Dave's point, if you're going to engage the public, you're going to have to explain why space is interesting. And the stories doesn't have to involve astronauts. One of the biggest stories was Beagle 2. The whole country got behind that, partly because it was lost and people were searching for it. But you have to capture people's imagination. And saying that it's about GPS and you couldn't survive without it, sorry, Alice, that doesn't cut it. What are the stories you are going to tell the public about what your agency will do that will transform their lives? What is the story that people are going to watch on social media? And that, I think, is, we've been rightly talking about policy and getting it right, developing the plumbing, but now's the time to talk about the content.
Right, very good. And there's a lot of questions at the back. Now, the lady here in the yellow towards the front.
Thank you for your knowledge and for sharing this and creating this space. Going into the future, I believe Paul mentioned that it's difficult to determine which companies will make it. What are the mechanisms that you use, apart from obviously the geopolitical environment, to decide or determine or bet which company will make it, and how did you develop those mechanisms?
Right. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause there because we've had some important questions, and then collect the final bunch. There's quite a few towards the back. Let's, Paul Bates, do you want to start on this issue of the how we capture the imagination, and also Georgie's observation about how we decide on our priorities and Eastern negotiations.
Yes. Okay. So I don't think there's any shortage of interest in the general public about space. You just got to tell the story right. It's certainly not about how many millions you put in. But one of the rare times that we managed to get onto Radio 4 and actually not get binned off 12 hours beforehand was when we launched a project which was, I think, with £250,000, a tiny amount of money, to look at blue-green algae on Windermere, because it mattered to people, that water pollution, it was salient. And when we launched Rosalind Franklin rover to Mars, I think people are going to be fascinated by the curiosity of, is there life outside Earth? Right? I think space, while it's really important that people understand how impactful it is to their daily lives, I also think it misses a trick to say that's the thing that we need to do. The wonderful thing about space is that it's the thing alongside dinosaurs that kids care about. And of course, if the dinosaurs had a space agency, they wouldn't have been wiped out. So I actually think the stories really, really matter, but they should be curiosity-driven and, sort of human-driven. They don't just have to be economically driven. I'm definitely going to duck the OneWeb question.
Dave?
Since I have no involvement or background in the OneWeb story at all, I can therefore comment. But I was kind of hinting at it in one of my action points, which is the reality is Europe is on the move. Iris Squared is happening. I remember far enough back when there was the UK view in certain quarters, Galileo, it's never going to happen. It did happen. It's onto its third generation. It's going to get better and more secure, more satellites, the low Earth orbit complement to it. The strategy that is now under Laurent Jaffard of integrating the telecoms, Iris Squared, the next generation of navigation with Galileo, and Earth surveillance, ISR, for the Commission into a system of systems is fundamental. Is the UK in that or not? And you have to know the answer to that, like now, please. And whether OneWeb is part of that, I have no idea. But I hope that people are working on that and we find out. But that was an example of those, don't wait for some document to be published in 6 months or a year's time. That has to be, everybody in industry needs to know where they're heading on that or not, like as soon as possible.
Alice?
Is it too late? Well, it can't be too late, can it? Because it's still there. We still have to make the most of a system that we have. What shape it arrives at, I don't know. Is it sensible to put all the bets in a European partnership? Probably not. So I think, your idea of being a bridge between our international partners is probably the way to go, because it's back to the sort of geopolitical story. It's very uncertain times, and that's just from a policy perspective. From a practical perspective, if the EU Space Act is enforced in the shape it's in at the moment, then that'll give us our answer. It won't be part of the European solution.
Paul?
I think Palab's point is really important. I think that where the public get shown how trying to do really difficult things as humans gives them hope in what's possible in the future is massively important in terms of making sure that there is that connection between the sort of the commercial, the business aspects, the GPS and so forth, and that asking difficult questions about what human beings are capable of doing and then trying to do it. And I think the Beagle point is because it got lost that people got interested in it. And therefore, it's those aspects of jeopardy and trying to do difficult things. And I have, just a personal story on this. So when I was science minister, my eldest child was a 13-year-old girl who was absolutely going to be a ballet dancer until I took her to the Kennedy Space Center. And then she wanted to be an astronaut. And she then went on to study physics. She's an master's in astronautical engineering. She then did a PhD funded by NASA, studying the effect of cosmic radiation on the brain, and she's doing a postdoc in Germany to understand the interaction between cosmic radiation and the brain, because if astronauts are going out of the magnetosphere, how are you going to protect them? But also, what can we learn from that for very short, very high energy particles being used to treat cancers of the brain? Yeah. And that is when people get, I think, really interested, is because you're asking very difficult science questions and you're understanding things which people can really relate to. But you've got to tell those stories, and that's why it was so fortunate that we learned that, yes, having our own, Tim Peake did a huge amount for the space industry, and, we need him to go up again. And we need to keep investing in human spaceflight. And UK needs to be a part of it, because that's how we're going to make sure that we've got the industry and the money to be able to continue to have a space industry. We've got to have those stories.
Alice?
I've got to jump in on this one. I respectfully disagree.
That's fine.
I don't think that our future is secure in space if we only think about, science and exploration. I absolutely take on the challenge that conveying in an inspiring and human-centered way the wider benefits of our space program is not easy, but I do think there is something in there. I mean, you made the point very well, I think, in connecting it to understanding cancer of the brain. I think another example where we did so well, and you'll remember this one, was the program where we launched a program to partner, the UK partnering with developing countries. Yeah. The stories from that were incredible. The way in which we were able to have an additional 6-month lead-in time in mobilising healthcare facilities to deal with mosquito-borne diseases, the incredible human impacts on that, I think is a story that can be told really well. And to nod to an earlier question, will we always be a bit player? It was an absolute highlight of my time as international director when I could go to a UN conference talking about the contribution of space to developing countries. And, with respect to our international partners, there was a lot of blah, blah. And actually, as the UK, to be able to stand up there and say, we have this programme, it is funded at, I think, 160 million, something like that, but leveraging 600 million of private investment was, a moment of genuine national pride.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's what you could do when you have a 0.7% of ODA spend.
Okay, I have to answer, Alice. It's not one or the other.
Yeah.
It's the two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I wasn't saying...
Yeah, no, and I don't think you were. That's why I'm sort of putting it together in peace and harmony, that the technology that enables you to build a telecom satellite, a lot of it, significant, is exactly the same as you need to do ISAM, is exactly the same as you need to do Earth observations, exactly the same as you need to do science. You don't have a bunch of people who just do SATCOMs over there and nothing else. So that if you say that one is more important, it's losing the big picture of how it's all part of two sides of the same coin: the commercial, the inspirational, the astronauts, the down-to-earth applications of space. It's the joined-up thing that we have to achieve, and that's a difficult story to tell. I know that, but I go back one story on Beagle 2. Thank you. I do remember the day of the separation of Beagle 2 from Mars Express. The headlines on the Evening Standard had a picture. It wasn't a picture. It was actually Huygens. A picture saying, "We're on the way to Mars." And you're right, that was the moment when the UK as a whole thought we were doing something. And if we can get more programmes and projects that are bringing the UK sector, academia, industry together, rather than always putting them against each other in competition, that would be a good thing.
All right, we've had a lot of suggestions. I'm inclined to add very briefly to the list, Palab. I think that some in-orbit manufacturing is where Britain does have a distinct strength. I think what Katie King at BioOrbit is doing with cancer immunotherapy drugs being produced in zero gravity is the kind of story that people can identify with. I think that the first UK vertical rocket launch from the UK will be a story. Well, it's nothing. It is not. Nobody set a date for it, but it will happen. And I would actually say, and I think Paul referred to this. There's powerful evidence of the amount of damage that is done by large numbers of satellites deorbiting. The King, who does very much have a focus on sustainability, his role in Astra Carta and his distinctive interest in the environment and sustainability and applying that to space is very powerful. So I think there are different, and I think those are always, incidentally, where in terms of being optimistic, those are two of those three areas are areas where Britain has a lead. We are in the lead on the sustainability campaign, and we have got some very sophisticated, with Space Forge as well, we're very sophisticated in microgravity manufacturing and identifying particular uses of that. Those are two areas where we can honestly say we're up there with the lead. Space launch is a bit of a catch-up, but we will get there. Now, we're going to collect. There's a lot of interventions towards the back, and we're going to hear you all, but if they can each intervention be kept very short, and then we'll have a final round from the panellists. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Claire for Deep Science Ventures and FST Council. One observation quickly and one question. Observation is I'm really struck by collectively across the panel how there's a lot of things you agree on. The challenges being R&D investment at scale, sovereignty, global competitiveness, etc. And what strikes me is that none of these are unique to the space sector. So we haven't cracked it in other sectors, and I'm wondering what the hope is for that. My question is, I feel like there's been an omission around skills this evening. Okay. So what's the state of skills in the space sector, and what can we learn from the history of skills in the UK?
Right, very good. Let's keep on rolling. Yep.
Hi, thank you for insightful talks today. I'm Astha. I'm working on the first UK-led space mission to address the problem of light pollution due to satellites. Dr. Alice, you present, being the president of UK Space, you present the commercial voice of the sector, and I wanted to get your opinion on, as the UK expands its role in the space economy, how is the government and the industry thinking about balancing the satellite growth with sustainability by protecting the dark and quiet skies and the astronomical infrastructure overall? And do you see the role of UK in leading on mitigation standards, and are there any plans to develop any policies and stronger collaboration, especially with the astronomy community? I'm happy to hear the views of other people on the panel.
Yes, light pollution, yes, at the back there. Yeah.
Hi, Rhys Mould, University of Westminster. My research, funded by the Gaia Foundation, focuses on how space affects our biology. So my question is, as manned spaceflight frequency increases, how does space health and life in space fit into your vision and priorities moving forward?
Thank you. Was there any other questions? There's a final question over here. Yes. Keep your hand up. So the microphone is coming. Where we are, yep.
Question for the last night of the question. Simple answer from all of you. Do you think it's likely...
Could you hold the microphone close to your mouth, please?
Do you think it's likely that there will be a UK organization, commercial or PPP, in inverted commas, which could achieve, say, a market cap of 5 billion or 10 billion or 15 billion? And how many of those companies or organizations could be in place in the next 10 years? You have SpaceX, which is going for an IPO of trillions. But just to understand where you think the UK commercial sector could achieve, is it sufficiently ambitious with support from government?
4 quick questions and final observations to the panelists. I'm going to start with you, Dave, and move along.
Which one do you want to answer?
Well, you have the luxury. You choose. You choose. Do you like pollution, actually?
Well, okay, not an expert. I would say that the mitigation measures that the constellation operators are starting to put in place is trying to manage the problem, but it's not going to go away. And I think the simple answer that astronomers should go into space and have their all telescopes there, it doesn't make any sense, doesn't work. So it's going to be a continuous backwards and forwards between the two communities and find a fair way of operating. In terms of the medical challenges in human spaceflight and so on, which I think was being hinted at, then I think there are some very interesting opportunities. I think there is real value in human spaceflight from the medical research point of view, but I would like to put a plug in for the open question that there is real inspirational benefit, opportunity of the UK flying the first astronaut with a physical disability. It is, John McFall is now ready to go. It's been, all the work, preparation work has been done to prove it's possible. It has real scientific value, has operational value. I really would like to see, find out how that's going to happen. That would be a wonderful thing for the country and for the whole space community. Thank you.
Great. Paul? Great.
So on the, will a UK company get a 5 billion plus valuation or IPO? I think it can be done. I mean, it's not that much, as you say, in the scale of things. And space is reasonably booming. 1.8 trillion economy, I think was highlighted earlier. You know, I wish I knew which one it would be, because I'd go invest in them. I can do that now. But there are some great companies out there. I mean, David's mentioned a few. Open Cosmos is another good example. So if we knew who would make it, obviously that'd be tremendous. But I think it's absolutely credible. Absolutely credible. But I also think it's a great question, but I think it's the wrong framing from a policy point of view, because whilst a 5 billion valuation or 10 billion valuation of one company is lovely, what matters much more is how much space powers the UK economy. UK economy is 3 trillion GDP. So, and we know that it's 18% of it is underpinned by space. So I care a lot more about how we get space, frankly, whether it's actually a UK space company or global space companies, to drive the UK economy forward. That is a many orders of magnitude bigger, important of any economic growth than the UK space sector itself is, or I suspect will ever be. Did you want concluding comments as well, David?
Yeah, do throw in something.
I'm just going to say one, and it's an anecdote, and it's from Megan Christian, who's our reserve astronaut. We currently have 3 astronauts, John, that Dave mentioned, Megan and Rose Coogan, who will fly. The aim is to fly her by 2030. But there was a little 10-year-old boy, and he was listening to a talk that Meg gave, and she'd been explaining her role, Rose's role. She'd been talking a lot about human spaceflight. And this little 10-year-old lad put up his hand and he said, "Can boys be astronauts too?" And I think if you want to know why space is important, that kind of says it all.
By the way, on the market cap question, there is a company created by a Brit, a graduate of the University of Leicester, inspired by a Brit, Martin Sweeting. I've just been checking. Will Marshall's Planet Labs is now valued at approximately $12 billion. It does have to be located in San Francisco, but it is absolutely a distinctively British vision, because it is low-cost, viable satellite. He was taking Martin Sweeting's model and applying it, and he learnt about it when he was a student at Leicester. Alice, over to you.
There's the rub. I'm going to take the skills question, because that hasn't been tackled yet. Again, this might be a slightly surprising answer. I don't think we have a skills problem at all in the UK. I think we have a large programme problem. We have programme at scale problem. The university system is still relatively healthy. We see it is an attractor. We see a lot of graduates come out, typically aerospace engineers, and they struggle to find jobs in the UK because we don't have an anchor programme at scale to support those graduates in their early careers, to train them up to be able to then make the contribution that we so hope for the growth of the sector in later years. I've been involved in a study with ESA recently. It does exactly this analysis across the whole of Europe, looking at where our space workforce is trained and looking at where the Space Force works. In the UK, it is absolutely shocking. It tells you that by a long margin, we have the greatest net loss of engineers. So people come to the UK, they like the universities in the UK, they get their degrees, and they then go typically over into mainland Europe. So I don't think we've got a skills problem, but we need a programme at scale to keep the engineers attracted to working in the UK.
Data point, when I did aeronautics and astronautics at Southampton University in 1981, there were 60 on the first year intake. This year it was 280 at A and A star entry grade. So the universities are producing plenty of fantastic people. The trick is how you turn academically trained engineers into experienced systems engineers who've built things, flown things, broken things, and are then able to do the big projects that Alice is talking about.
Thank you. Paul?
So I believe the answer to the gentleman's question there really depends upon whether we fix the late-stage financing problem in this country.
Mm-hmm.
The challenges that the space sector faces, they're common to all of the major technology, science-based sectors. And we know that we have a very strong science base. I agree, relating to we have the talent. But we have had a bonkers approach to allowing other people to buy up our core companies, to encourage our entrepreneurs to go to San Francisco, and to say that it's perfectly okay. It really isn't okay. It really matters where the wealth stays. We are increasingly a poorer country as a result of not properly commercializing the talent and know-how that we have in this country. And I'm optimistic about the future because you're starting to see the political rhetoric to go from where it was saying that, the toxic vocabulary of picking winners to we need to make intelligent strategic choices about what this country is going to be world class at, where it's going to create the wealth to pay for the public services that we want. And that means government choosing where it's going to invest. And that means being more French, if I may say so. I had an interesting few years as the British director on the main board of Airbus and saw the relationship between Airbus management and the German government and the French government and the Spanish government, and the way in which the British government acted as it's an arm's length body. We need to have deep relationships with the strategic businesses that we have the potential of growing here in this country in the future. And we need to fight like hell to keep them here and to keep them owned here. To do that, we need to be muscular with our pension industry to stop investing our pensions abroad and investing here in the UK.
Thank you very much. And that reminds me, actually, of the question from George Freeman that we haven't really answered, because it is a vivid example, sadly, of what you are warning about, Paul, in that the and I was one of the people who did argue for taking that stake, and the Treasury then thought it would be grossly improper if space policy had any connection to our ownership of OneWeb. And the shareholding in OneWeb was put in the arm's length shareholder executive. And we were told at the space agency we should have and the non-executive, government non-executives on the board were not to have any relationships with the space agency, and the space agency was not to have a special relationship with OneWeb because that would somehow favor it against other entities, when the other entities were Elon Musk's and Jeff Bezos's. And there was absolutely a model that it would be improper to link the fact you own these shares to space policy. And I've also been at meetings where it had been thought improper that the MOD decision about where the next generation of secure comms, that contract should go, should be in any way related to industrial strategy. That was also improper. So there is a different intellectual model, and I do think that in the last few years, that model has finally been broken down, but that's above all been because of the rise of the pervasive security considerations. But it does still reside in parts of Whitehall.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I think there is an opportunity now. And as Paul said earlier, the space agency, sometimes this narrative, all we ever did was fritter the money away on lots of tiny little startups. If you look at the way the money goes, there is half a dozen or so medium-sized, rapidly growing space companies which have had sustained support from the space agency. But absolutely, more of that needs to happen, and much more systematically, and it has to include procurement decisions. And there is the potential for that to happen in the future. So look, I hope we can end on the note that we are celebrating the history of 16 years of the UK Space Agency. And there were successes, and there were also missed opportunities and mistakes. But I hope we can also wish well to the new space agency integrated inside one department with a much more coherent and single line of communication rather than two lines of communication. And we must hope that the warnings from some of our panelists about what could go wrong are heeded, and that this new entity thrives and succeeds. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you. Thank you. What a walk down memory lane.
I'm easier having